tonight, I hope you have your scriptures handy, because we are actually going to be reading quite a bit in your scriptures. So if you don't have them, we'll give you a minute. Go grab your scriptures, or if you have a Bible program, pull it up, because we are going to be reading. So tonight we are beginning chapter 15. Chapter 15 begins with an era of blessing. Now, let me just recap, because I know it's been we've been going a little bit, taking a break, and then going a little bit. So far, what we have read in Deuteronomy 27 outlined curses. There were certain things that if you did those things, then you would fall under the curses of the law. And you could do that as an individual, as a family, but more than likely, these were sins that you would commit as a nation. And when you committed these sins as a nation, it was considered a violation of the covenant that your nation had made with Yehovah at Mount Sinai. So these curses brought consequences, which we will look at more in depth in the upcoming weeks. Tonight, what we're going to do is focus on the blessing. Now, Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 through 30. What you find is kind of a repetitive cycle. The first time the first time Israel enjoyed these blessings occurred when there was a tabernacle residing among Israel. So it would have been during the Judges era, right around 1508 all the way down to 1466. You find that Israel was walking in the way of Yehovah. They had Yehovah's tabernacle among them at Shiloh, and Israel had readily access to Yehovah, to the priesthood, at any time she wished. You also find that this was a time of prosperity during the Judges era, where Israel was chasing the enemies out of the promised land. Archaeologically, we know that at least 233 cities were destroyed. These were highly fortified. Some of the walls were up to 70 feet tall. Others were 50 feet tall. That massive fortifications, usually built up on a hill with ramparts, often glacier. And you find that most of these cities were destroyed right around 1500 BCE. So there's a lot of evidence that Yehovah was with Israel, that he was fighting Israel's battles for her. Now, if you guys will remember, right around 1466, Israel had rebelled. Remember, Israel served Yehovah all the days of Joshua and the elders that outlived him. But beginning with that third generation, they really departed from the way of Yehovah and began walking in their own ways and worshiping other deities. With this polytheism, you find that God sends a messenger to Shiloh at one of the annual Sukkots when they are coming together and convocating. And this angel tells, or this messenger's Malek tells Israel that Yehovah will no longer fight Israel's battles for them, and that Israel is basically on their own. The nation weeps, so that Shechem becomes Bochum, kind of a play on words there. And there's bitterness in the camp of Israel and throughout the tribes. So you find that the era of the tabernacle era lasts for 350 years before the tabernacle is destroyed by the Philistines. At that point in time, Samuel and Japheth lead Israel to the interior area of Mizpah, probably in the northeastern region, for security and for safety reasons. They dwell there for a period of time. There's different estimates as to how long Israel lived without a tabernacle. It could have been 80 years. It could have been a little bit longer. But you find that with the installation of the monarchy, during this time where Israel is living without a tabernacle, where Yehovah is not residing among them, you find that Israel asks for a king. So Saul is installed. And this begins actually an era of blessing. And this era of blessing even occurs a little bit earlier under Samuel. Samuel begins to recover I believe it's 23 cities that the Philistines had taken from Israel. Samuel begins to lead Israel, and they recover these territories. Saul recovers more territories, and this really begins to expand Israel's border and provide another enclave, another interior where Israel would have peace, where she would not be molested by her enemies. So you find this occurs, and then once there is a united monarchy, once David ascends the throne, you find this continues this era of peace within Israel. Israel is chasing her enemies. She is not being chased by her enemies. So this is kind of an overcap of how the testimony works. It occurred the first time in the Judges era. The second time it occurred was during the United Monarchy. And the third time that it occurs, which we're not going to get into yet, we will in future classes, will be during the Second Temple period. Anytime there is a tabernacle or there is a temple that exists on Israel's land, these cultic judgments go into effect. Where if Israel walks with Yehovah, if they obey, there are blessings and there are no consequences. But if they depart from the way, then you find that these consequences are going to catch up to Israel, and they are going to affect Israel's descendants. So I hope by now you have your scriptures handy, because like I said, we are going to be reading directly from scripture tonight. And I am going to go grab my, oh, you know what? I forgot to, let me do this real quick. I'm going to go grab my, hold on. Okay, there it is. My slideshow. So here we go. I'm going to share it, and you should be seeing what I'm seeing. All right. So again, these are short pages. We're only doing about 6 pages tonight. And the first, whoa, this went too fast. Okay. So the first thing that we see is an epic of blessing. This would have been the United Monarchy era. And I encourage each of you to really sit down. This is going to be on page, it begins on page 109 and 110. And, just take about 20 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, and really compare Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14 with Leviticus 26, 1 through 13. The comparison and the similarities with what the covenant at Mount Sinai, as well as the covenant on the plains of Moab, the similarities between these are just outstanding. So we're going to go ahead and read these, and then we're going to do a little comparison on our own after we read this chapter. So I'm going to go ahead and just start with Leviticus 26, verse 1. This is an epic of blessing. This is what the text states. You shall make no idols or graven images, neither shall you rear up a standing image, neither shall you set up any image of stone in your land to bow down to it. For I am Yehovah your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am Yehovah. If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, then I will give you rain in due season, and your land shall yield her increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. And your threshing shall reach the vintage, and the vintage shall reach the sowing time. And you shall eat their bread to the full, and dwell in the land safely. And I will give you peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none will make you afraid. And I will rid evil beasts of the land. Neither shall the sword go through your land, and you shall chase your enemies, and they will fall before you by the sword. And 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 shall put 10,000 to flight. And your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. For I will have respect to you, and make you fruitful, and multiply you, and establish my covenant with you. And you will eat of the old store, and bring forth of the new, because of the new. And I will set my tabernacle among you, and my soul will not abhor you. And I will walk among you, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. I am Yehovah, your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their bondmen. I have broken your bands and your yoke, and made you go upright. Now, if you were reading this in the book, and Yehovah exists, you will find that I have inserted A, B, C, D points that we're going to talk about throughout the pages of the book, and we're going to elaborate on those. But I also want to point out that the A, B, C, D points also correlate to the same points that we're going to find in Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 4. So these are the exact same points. Now, what we're going to find is that Deuteronomy, throughout the testimony, Deuteronomy always adds more information than does the Sinai covenant. Greater detail. Yehovah had greater time to get to know Israel during the 40 years in the wilderness. So when they're on the plains of Moab, about to come into the promised land, Yehovah is able to give more detail because he knows Israel better. So again, the points that we're going to read on page 710 do correlate with the points of Leviticus 26. So we're going to begin in Deuteronomy 28, verse 1, and we're going to read all the way through verse 14. It states, "And it shall come to pass, if you will diligently listen to the voice of Yehovah your God, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command you this day, that Yehovah your God will set you on high above all nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you. And if you shall listen to the voice of Yehovah your God, blessed be you in the city, and blessed be you in the field. Blessed be you in the fruit of your body. Blessed be you in the ground. Blessed be you in the fruit of your cattle, and the increase of your cows, and the flocks of your sheep. Blessed shall you be in your basket and in your store. Blessed shall you be when you come in, and blessed shall you be when you go out. Yehovah will cause your enemies that rise up against you to be smitten before your face. They shall come out against you one way and flee before you 7 ways. Yehovah shall command the blessing on you for your storehouses and in all that you set your hand to do, and he will bless you. And the hand which Yehovah your God shall bless you. I'm sorry, I lost my spot. In your storehouses, and shall give you, and he will establish you as a holy people to himself, as he has sworn, if you shall keep the commandments of Yehovah your God and walk in his ways. And all people shall keep the commandments of Yehovah your God to walk in his ways. And all the earth shall see that you are called by the name of Yehovah, and they shall be afraid of you. And Yehovah shall make you plenteous in goods, and in the fruit of your body, and the fruit of your cattle, and the fruit of your ground, and the land which Yehovah swore to give your fathers to give to you. And Yehovah will open to you his good treasure of the heaven to give you rain in your land in his season, and bless the work of your hand. And you shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. Yehovah will make you the head and not the tail. And you shall be above only, you shall not be beneath. If that you listen to the commandments of Yehovah your God, which I command you this day, to observe and to do them. And to do them. And you shall not go aside from any of the words which I command you this day, to the right hand, or to offer, or to go after other gods to serve them. So what we find is a tremendous time of blessing. This would have occurred during the administrations of Samuel, Saul, David, and Solomon. This would have roughly covered a little about 70 years of time period at this time. And what you find is that many of these things can be evidenced during this time period in Israel's history. And let's go through some of the blessings that God specifically promises to give to Israel. Number 1, rain in due season. I don't know, I saw a blurb today on the Weather Channel stating that many of the I don't know if it would be the swamps, but many of the land around Disney World in Florida is a raging furnace. I guess they've had epic droughts this year, and some forest fires have begun, and so there's just fires raging out of control. We see fires raging out of control all the time in California, Colorado, even Spain a couple of years ago had trouble with this. Rain in due season is so important because crops are able to give their yield with the proper amounts of rain. So A, of course, leads to B, which is that the land will yield her increase. And B leads to C, which is abundance. God says that the threshing reaches until the vintage, and the vintage to the sowing. In other words, there is so much profit, there is so much abundance that it's going to take Israel 4 or 5 months to reap. And then when they get to the vintage, which would be in the fall, right before Sukkot, you're going to find that that vintage last all the way until it's time to sow again. So this just really accounts for a great blessing and abundance within the land of Israel. And this is not just the wealth of having enough food to eat and enough food to sell, which also gave Israel wealth, but it establishes healthy offspring. Having fruitful offspring means that there are no genetic defects. There are no congenital diseases. Rather, everybody is born healthy. And this really establishes the covenant that Yehovah had made with Abraham. Because remember, as far back as Genesis 12 and Genesis 15, the very first things that Yehovah promises Abraham are twofold. One, to have children as numerous as the sand or the stars. And number two, that they will inherit specifically the land of Canaan. So these are the two aspects of the covenant. And God specifically states that he will bless Israel with fruitful offspring if they will walk in his covenants. They will have the surplus of old and new harvest. This means that they have such an abundance that they will not use up what they have every year, but they will probably end up selling it to other nations, which will give them, again, another source of wealth and income. Yehovah's tabernacle will be established among the people, and he will not abhor Israel. And this is really when we saw with the circumcision covenant in Genesis 17. This is where Yehovah stated that he would make Israel his people. And what we see God doing with these blessings is fulfilling that promise, fulfilling that covenant with the nation, to make Israel a people before him, to allow Israel to have a relationship with him, to come physically before the face of God there at the tabernacle. The other thing that we find are ideas of national independence. Leviticus 26, right around verse 13, states that their bands will be broken and they will walk upright. This really comes to the context of slavery. If you look at slaves depicted on Egyptian tombs, within the walls of Egyptian tombs, or you look at slaves being depicted on Assyrian reliefs from Nimrod, what you find is that often there's like a pillory, there's a collar around the neck, and the slaves are depicted as slouched, broken. Their spirit is broken. They are physically broken because they are brought into bondage. They've lost the freedom of choice. They are living under coercion, and they have no ability to choose how to live life for themselves. So this is something where you cannot hold your head up high because of the sorrow of heart, because your life is no longer your own. So this is, to me, one of the most important aspects of the covenant that Yehovah made with Israel, and the blessing that he gives to them, is that they have this national independence where they can walk upright. They can have a healthy pride in knowing that they are walking righteously. Remember, Deuteronomy 4 verses 6 through 8 talks about Israel walking in Yehovah's ways of wisdom, and other nations seeing this wisdom and them wanting to also learn of Yehovah and his ways. because of the blessings that Israel has, as well as the justice that she enjoys. The other thing, and this is H is found more in Deuteronomy. This is not reiterated in Leviticus. So this is a new point that Deuteronomy makes, which is Israel will not depend on other nations through debt. Rather, Israel will have so much surplus that she will lend to other nations, but she will have no need to borrow because she will just really have too much. So this the ability to lend to other nations causes Israel to become the head of all nations. This is really what we see in America today, where America has, for the last 50 years, 70 years, been the head of all nations. We lead the way when it comes to support of the UN. They're really dependent on America for monetary support. You know, if we go along with something and sanction it, then they're able to do it. But if we withhold our support, then it makes it very difficult. And thankfully, this is kind of the position and the clout now that Nikki Haley has with the state of Israel and standing up for the state of Israel as far as human rights are concerned, and as far as being kind of that barrier between all the Islamic nations, always wanting to condemn Israel and single Israel out for human rights violations, when comparatively speaking, what you find among Arab nations is really so much more egregious. So the other thing that we find in these blessings, and I don't have it reiterated in this list, but I am going to go ahead and bring it up, is the idea of military prowess. We find in Leviticus 26, it is stated, when you go out and when you come in. The phrase going out, anytime you read the phrase, you know, the kings of Israel went out, or Israel went out before Yehovah, that is always a reference to a military campaign. So when Israel goes out before Yehovah, he is promising that they will have success in any military endeavors that they undertake during this time of blessing, because, of course, they are walking in the way of Yehovah. And it is that walking in the way of Yehovah that in and of itself brings blessing and brings its own reward through power and surplus and abundance. So again, national obedience brings the blessings of the law. There are no curses. Now, during the epoch of national blessings, Samuel and Saul began to subjugate the Canaanite region, while David established Israel's borders. He united the tribes and inaugurated a time of peace. Solomon inherited that peace. You may remember that Solomon was called a man of peace. It is stated that during Solomon's reign, there was no adversary or evil occurrent throughout the entire nation of Israel during Solomon's reign, until we get to the latter end of his reign, when he rebels against Yehovah, after Yehovah had appeared to him in a dream and covenanted with him 2 separate times. So, but this is early on, and it's still a time of blessing. So Solomon's wealth increased abundantly as nations far and near brought their gifts and observed his wisdom. Israel became a holy people who were called in the name of Yehovah, and they were feared. Now, this idea of being feared by other nations has the idea that when other nations fear you, they are not going to antagonize you. They are not going to renege on treaties or contracts that they make with you, but rather there is going to be accountability. This was the era when Israel became the head and the lender to many nations with no need to borrow. One of the examples that I gave on page 711 was the idea that David, as a refugee in Philistine territory, had raided many, many cities. And what he would do is, after he raided a city, he wouldn't leave anyone alive. There would be no witnesses to state anything that happened to that city, because everybody was killed. But he would take the wealth of that city and send it back to the leaders of Judah. So this made for a very friendly alliance between Judah and David, so that when there comes a time after Saul's death for a king to be established on the throne, Judah really does not hesitate whatsoever to establish David. And you find that this really solidifies the kingdom in David's hands. Now, let me just, before we get to the curses, I wanted to reiterate a couple other texts. Psalms 23 verse 5 talks about Israel's cup running over. Malachi 3 verse 10 had talked about how in past times there was a blessing poured out, that there was not room enough to receive it. All of these signify such an incredible abundance that it really spills over into other nations and ends up blessing other nations because Israel is doing righteously. Let me see if there's anything else I want to cover here before we move on. The zenith, of course, of this time period is God dwelling among Israel. So now we're going to transition from this era of blessing to the period of curses. So what Leviticus and Deuteronomy do in the very beginning, remember how we saw in Deuteronomy 27, how it just simply outlined the curses, you are cursed if you do these things. Well, Leviticus 26, and there's only 2 verses in Leviticus and 5 verses in Deuteronomy. But what they do is they just give an outline, kind of a summary, an overview or an introductory paragraph into the curses that will occur in Israel's future. At this point, there is no chronological designation. So this is just simply outlining them and saying, this is going to be the ultimate result if you do not walk in the way of Yehovah. So let's read this. We're going to begin in Leviticus 26, verse 14, and we'll read through verse 16. And it states, but if you will not listen to me and will not do all these commandments, and if you will despise my statutes, or if your soul abhors my judgments, so that you will not do my commandments, but that you break my covenant, I will also do this to you. And then what you find is that the succeeding verses, verses 17 through 19, what we're going to see as we go into the next section is that there are very specific curses that fall on Israel at very specific intervals. Leviticus calls these 7 times. So these are 7-time periods where those particular curses fall on Israel and they adhere to Israel. And what you find is that when you progress from one 7-time into the next 7-time, those curses don't always stay. Sometimes they disappear and they are displaced or replaced by even harsher penalties during the next phase of judgment or the next phase of correction. So now the corollary to Leviticus 26, 14 through 16 is going to be Deuteronomy 28, 15 through 20. And this is what the text states. But it shall come to pass, if you will not listen to the voice of Yehovah your God, to observe all these commandments and his statutes, which I command you this day, that these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the field. Cursed shall you be in the basket and in your store. Cursed shall you be in the fruit of your body and the fruit of your land, and your increase of your cows and your flocks and your sheep. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed will you be when you go out. Yehovah will send on you cursing, vexation, and rebuke in all that you set your hand to do, until you are destroyed, until you perish quickly because of the wickedness of your doings, whereby you have forsaken me. So what we find is that the ultimate consequence, if Israel does not repent during this phase of correction, if she continues in her way, the ultimate consequence will be that the land will be forsaken, and the fact that Israel will perish. She will perish from the land, as well as her life will come to an untimely end. So you find that these curses are activated for one reason and one reason only, Israel has turned from Yehovah, and she has rebelled against the covenant. She has done the cursed things of the law and rejected Yehovah's counsel. So notice these curses, they affect all the blessings that were previously given are now just reversed. Israel will have ill health. Her children will be born with congenital diseases. You find that there will be a shortage of crops. Disease will affect crops. When Israel goes into battle, they're going to lose battles. So they are going to become the tail. Because they don't have enough to eat, they're going to have to borrow from other nations. They're going to have to sell themselves to other nations just in order to survive. So this becomes something that is very, very painful for Israel. And we also find that during this united monarchy period, when the curses begin to fall on Israel, you find that this really corresponds with Numbers 33 effacement judgment, which is found in Numbers 33, right around verses 55 and 56, where Yehovah states, all those things that I had thought to do to your enemies in order to secure the land for you, I will do those things to you. So Israel will be driven from the land. Her high places will be brought down. Her land will be divided and given to her enemies. All those things that Israel failed to do, again, will be applied to Israel. And what is fascinating as we read through this is that the curses in Deuteronomy 28 do indeed incorporate every aspect of the judgment found in Numbers 33. So it's really interesting when you look at the specific words and how they correlate. All right, so we're going to go grab our next slide here. Okay, there it is. I had a hard time going. Okay, so curses come simply for these reasons. If Israel will not listen or obey, if Israel will not follow Yehovah's judgments, and if Israel will break Yehovah's covenants. These are the only three reasons for which the blessings will be turned into curses. Now, what are the specific curses? Cursed in the field, in the basket, in the store, cursed in the fruit of the body, cursed in flocks of herds, in war, and the ultimately destroyed off the land, destroyed as a nation, and eventually perish as a people. Again, this comes to what we're going to see later on in Deuteronomy 28, right around verses 55 through about verse 59, where the text states that you will fear for your life. In the morning you will say, woe that it would evening, and in the evening, woe that it would morning, and you will you will be fearful of a shaking leaf, thinking that it's some enemy coming to pursue you. So this is a very, very fearful and very doubtful time for Israel as she lives under constant persecution during that phase of the testimony. But this just outlines the ultimate consequence of what will occur when the curses fall on Israel. So the curses begin in 944 BCE when the kingdom divides. Now, the question is, why is this? And this really comes down to the reason that it waited for so long, even though Solomon rebelled against Yehovah. God said that he would not take the kingdom out of Solomon's hands for his servant David's sake, as well as for Israel's sake, because Israel was still a righteous nation at that point in time. But there was actually another blessing given by Jacob that also affects this. So Jacob, in Genesis 49, when he had called the 12 sons before him, and he gives each son their inheritance, he gives them their legacy, which is more prophecy than anything, because he establishes specific prophecies for each and every tribe in Israel. Some of them are geopolitical prophecies or allotments of land, but for Judah, it's something very different. If you will recall, there were 3 brothers that were older than Judah. And the way that a birthright and blessing work is that a birthright, which is a portion of land, and a blessing, which is the right to rule over your people, are usually given to the firstborn, unless they have done something egregious in their life, at which point it falls to the succeeding children. So Reuben lost the birthright and the blessing because he slept with Bilhah, which was Jacob's concubine. You find that Simeon and Levi lost their blessing simply because of the fact that, well, not simply, but because they did destroy the men of Shechem. That was just a heinous crime that was totally unjust, totally unmerciful, and totally unwarranted. So for their evil actions, they do not inherit the birthright or the blessing. So the next eligible son is then Judah. Judah is then eligible to inherit the birthright, which he does. So Judah inherits a double portion of land, and you find that he also inherits the blessing, the right to rule over his brothers. Now, you find that because the other brothers did not inherit, as well as the fact that because the brothers had afflicted Joseph, that Joseph's sons also gain a double inheritance, where they have a double portion of land. However, the right to rule is specifically given, the blessing is specifically given to Judah. And this is Jacob's prophecy for Judah. And the word scepter here is shabet. And this word can be translated as either scepter or tribes. When you look at this, the way this word is translated, it has about like an 85% of the time Shabbat is translated tribes. Only about 14% of the time or less is it translated scepter. So I think this provides for a great understanding of this text when you read the word tribe. So we're just going to say tribes here. And this is the blessing God gave to Judah. He says, the tribe shall not depart from Judah, or a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, and to him shall the gathering of the people be. When you look in Israel's history, you find that the king of peace in Israel's history was Solomon. There were no wars in Solomon's time period. In fact, David had warred so much that he had secured the entire territory that it says that Solomon sat down to a peaceful reign. It was so peaceful that God allowed Solomon to build the temple for him. And you find that all people were gathered unto Solomon during his reign. But this also answers a very important question. If Solomon had departed from the way of Yehovah, if he had rebelled against God, even though God had covenanted with him twice, why did God not rip the kingdom out of his hand during his lifetime? Well, I think this prophecy really prevented that from occurring during Solomon's lifetime, because the prophecy is that the tribes will not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. So it's after Shiloh, after this blessing, that then the tribes do indeed depart from Judah. So this, I think, was a covenant. It governed what the judgment that God could affect on Israel and when he could affect it. Now, we find throughout Scripture as well that God will not do this also for David's sake. So this is the prophecy that Abijah spoke to Solomon regarding rending the kingdom out of his hand. And this is what it says. Wherefore Yehovah has said to Solomon, for as much as this is done of you, and because you have not kept my covenant and statutes which I have commanded you, I will surely rend the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Notwithstanding, in your days I will not do it for David your father's sake, but I will rend it out of the hand of your son. Howbeit, I will not rend all the kingdom, but will give one tribe for your son, for David, my servant's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, which I have chosen. So you find throughout Kings and Chronicles this idea that God will not do it for David's sake. And it will, in other texts, will say, so that David always had a light. Now, this idea of David always having a light comes back to the covenant that Yehovah had made with David, that one of his sons would always be sitting and ruling on the throne as long as the nation existed. So this next prophecy is referring to Jehoram, where God said he would not destroy the house of David because of the covenant he had made with David, as much he has promised to always give him a light to him and his sons forever. So this again is the idea that as long as the nation of Israel exists, David will have a descendant ruling on that throne for the nation of Israel. And God will not put the curses fully to rend the kingdom completely out of David's hand, but he will always have respect to that covenant. Now, let me just reiterate, we're going to really recap this more as we get into it next week. But we are going to do a quick overview of the curses that begin to fall on Israel. So the first set of curses are going to be the first 70 years, or the first 7 times. So this is going to go right from 944 BCE all the way down to 874 BCE. So what we find is that each 7 times is a 70-year period. And I think as we go through this and we see how Isaiah and Jeremiah build on this, you guys might be able to see this and go, oh yeah, that is 70 years, because that pattern just really repeats it so much with the prophets basing their prophecies on it. So what we're going to find is that during this time period, this first period of curses, the kings of Samaria are going to be Jeroboam all the way through Ahab for the northern kingdom. And for Judah, the kings are going to be Rehoboam all the way through Jehoshaphat. And there are going to be very specific curses that are going to fall on the kingdom of Israel. You're going to find that they are going to be cursed in the field, cursed in the fruit of their body, and cursed in their increase. These are the specific ones. Notice there's no talk of war at this particular point of time. That curse does not yet fall on Israel. Notice there's no discussion as we go through this. There's no discussion of the tabernacle or being destroyed in any way. So that is a curse that will remain or await a later time period. So if you have your scriptures handy, we're just going to read this. And we will not read this probably when we come back in a couple weeks, since we have read it this evening. But join me. We're going to look at Deuteronomy 28, verse 22. And again, notice how the points that we have, that I have inserted into the text, notice how they either repeat, but then notice especially how they repeat and are the exact same points. The exact same thing is being stated in both Deuteronomy and Leviticus. So Deuteronomy 28, verse 22. Yehovah will smite you with a consumption, and with fever, and with inflammation, and with an extreme burning, and with the sword, and with blasting, and with mildew, and they shall pursue you until you perish. And then the corollary is Leviticus 26, verse 16, where Yehovah says, and I will do this to you. I will even appoint over you terror, consumption, and the burning ague, that they consume your eyes for the sorrow of your heart, and you shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. So notice that with this, notice they both talk about consumption. Now, fever, consumption, inflammation, all of these are begin diseases that people begin to be affected by. Fever, you know, today we have various means to treat fever with antibiotics, something as simple as Tylenol or ibuprofen. They did not have those remedies back then, and a very high fever when you're fighting an infection could lead to death very quickly, sometimes with as short as a few hours. But what we see is the same pattern and the same curses being issued for the exact same time period in Israel's future. So when we look at this, we find that there are curses being placed on Israel's produce. There are curses of blasting and blight. When we come back, we're going to look at some of the specific curses that are placed on Israel, as well as some different types of curses throughout history that affect crops. Many of these can often cause death because of the blight of the crops. What we also find is that Israel's increase begins to be depleted, and she now comes under tribute to foreign nations. So where she was once lending to other nations, now not only is she not able to lend to them, but now her power has decreased to the point where she has to pay tribute to other nations. So we are going to pick it up here next week. I didn't want to go thoroughly through this one because I really wanted to pick it up again with this first curse and proceed on through the next 3 curses of the law. And again, remember, with the testimony, these are chronological time periods that occur. You're going to find when we look at the second curse in the law, the most notorious famines in Israel's history occurred during that exact phase in Israel's law. Not before that and not after do we find those incredible famines. So this really attests to the validity and veracity of the chronology that Yehovah establishes at both Mount Sinai and reiterates and fills in the details on the plains of Moab. So that is going to conclude tonight's class. Do we have any questions or comments? I always appreciate it when you guys have something to add or something that you have seen that I've overlooked. I always look forward to hearing that. And let me just reiterate, next week I am out of town again. And then the following week, the end of the month of April, we will be at the United Israel Conference in St. Francisville. This will be a very large gathering, and I invite each of you to join us. If you don't have the information, please check the website for United Israel World Union. You can register there. It is also on Facebook, so I invite each and every one of you to join us. Well, I see there are no questions, so I'm going to go ahead and close the class down. I invite each of you to join us tomorrow morning at United Israel, the South Center via YouTube, where we will be there again. And there is a link posted on Facebook. So I invite y'all to join us, and I appreciate you joining. Thank you for taking your Friday evening and spending it with me. It's always great to see you guys and to interact with you. So have a wonderful, peaceful Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.